In 1986, Atari released their 1040 STF to the market. This computer, while quite capable versus its contemporaries, wasn't the fastest, didn't have the best sound or graphics, didn't have the most software available, and didn't have the most elegant graphical user interface. However, what it did have was 1 megabyte of RAM at a price significantly lower than its competitors. This made this Atari the first computer ever to break the $1 per kilobyte threshold at a list price of $9.99 USD. In today's video, we're going to talk about RAM in the Atari ST. Let's get to it. Greetings, and welcome to the Power of Vintage. Today's video is a part of my Atari ST 101 series of videos that cover a range of topics associated with getting started with this series of computers. Today, we're going to talk about RAM in the Atari ST. For today's video, I'm going to leave the Atari Falcon and TT out of the mix because they operate a bit differently with different CPUs and MMUs. We'll focus on the Motorola 68000 powered Ataris, meaning the ST and STEs specifically. We'll also talk purely about what's called ST RAM, since this is an Atari ST 101 video, and Alt RAM or TT RAM or Fast RAM falls more at the 201, 301 level and can kind of muddy the waters a bit. Let's first start off with a little background on the RAM capabilities of the Atari ST or STEs. The Motorola 68000 CPU is capable of addressing 16 megabytes of RAM at a maximum. And for the Atari ST, the theoretical maximum of that 16 megabytes would be 15 megabytes, since the last 1 megabyte of space is reserved for peripherals and ROM. Even though the Motorola 68000 CPU could address up to 16 megabytes of RAM, and the Atari ST could potentially theoretically address 15 megabytes of RAM, it was limited by its memory management unit chip, which restricted the amount of memory it could address to 4 megabytes in total. Now, looking at its contemporaries at the time, you have the Macintosh SE and the Amiga, which could each address 4 megabytes and 10 megabytes respectively. Now, I know that some folks are going to comment in the comments below about, well, the Amiga is different because of XYZ reason, Macintosh is different because of Y, ABC reason, and that you have to compare chip RAM to ST RAM, which is the 4 megabytes, blah, 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 blah. Put that in the comments below. Love to hear about it. And I'd love to learn more as well. Atari used a couple different naming conventions to denote the RAM in their Atari STs. And in reality, almost all Atari STs denoted the amount of RAM in the naming conventions. Not all of them, but most of them. Let's start with the 520 ST, or 520 ST, 520 STF, and 520 STE. That 520 denotes 512 kilobytes of RAM, or half a megabyte of RAM. Moving on to the 1040 STF, STE. Those denote 1 megabyte or 1024 kilobytes of RAM. There's a slightly different naming convention that came about with the Mega ST. When you got to the Mega ST as well as the Stacy, they used Mega 1 or Mega ST1, Mega 2, Mega ST2, Mega 4, Mega ST4, or Stacy 1, 2, or 4 to denote 1, 2, or 4 megabytes of RAM within those computers. Now, the Mega STE did not have RAM included in the naming convention, but it would simply have the RAM amount installed stamped on the product label on the bottom of the computer, a 1, 2, or 4 megabytes respectively. There were also a few odd naming conventions that were thrown in the mix as well. You have the 260 ST, which is likely initially planned on being a 256 kilobyte ST. However, when it actually finally launched, they'd all been reconfigured to 512 kilobytes RAM. Correct me if I'm wrong. If someone got a quarter of a gigabyte, a 256K Atari ST at some point, let me know. But from what I've been able to research and learn about, they were all retrofitted to 512 kilobytes of RAM, at least as a minimum. And then you have the 520 ST Plus, which was a 520 ST, the original short computer case, but had been factory fitted with 1 megabyte of RAM. Now, Both those models, the 260 ST and 520 ST Plus, they were only found and sold in Europe. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but everything I can find is that those were only found and used and sold in Europe. If you had one in the US, please let me know in the comments below. That'd be super awesome to hear about. Now, there are even rumors of a 4160 STE that existed, but everything I've read and researched is that configuration was never factory produced. More likely what had taken place is that dealers would retrofit a 1040 STE with 4 megabytes of RAM, and then swap the badge with a 4160 STE badge. Correct me if I'm wrong, if someone bought one that was factory built with 4 megabytes of RAM, share with me the reference for it. I'd love to see that. But everything I've been able to find out is that the maximum that you could ever get produced from the factory was 1040 or 1 megabyte of RAM in an STE. They're very easy to upgrade, so it's not a far stretch to be able to get it up to a 4160 STE. So what does more RAM provide to you? Why would you want to get a little more RAM in your Atari ST, especially today? If you look at the library of software, the majority of that library was written with the 520 ST in mind, the base configuration. And so the majority of that software that is available does run on the 520 ST. However, later in the life cycle, say early 90s and later, you start seeing more and more software requiring 1 megabyte of RAM. It's still not the lion's share of the software, but some of the more cool things, in my case, Ultima 6 or Civilization, video games, required at least 1 megabyte of RAM. And to be frank, those two games were exactly what got me to upgrade my original 520 ST I had picked up when I started collecting vintage computers back in the 2010s. A second reason why you would want to potentially get more RAM in your Atari ST is to use a hard drive more effectively. Now, if you look at a hard drive with an Atari ST, and I think with any computer, there are drivers that are required in order for the computer to know how to access the data on the hard drive. And anytime a driver is involved, that driver does take up an amount of RAM. So let's just take, for example, you have 512 kilobytes of RAM, and you need to consume 15, 17, 30, 40 kilobytes of RAM in order to load the hard disk driver to access your hard disk. That reduces the available amount of RAM to run software at that point in time. So once you boot onto the hard drive, you no longer have 512 kilobytes of RAM available to you. You have something less than that. And since a lot of the software was designed, again, back to my previous point, to run with that 512 kilobytes of RAM, you're going to start running into some issues with software programs that will not be able to run, that you don't have enough RAM in order to run. Now, that's especially evident when you start running with a 520 ST, and I found that myself when I first started using hard drives. And then there is some amount of that you do see with a 1 megabyte computer, but much less so, right? Because there's more flexibility in that space. Even the software that quote unquote needs 1 megabyte of RAM didn't necessarily use a full megabyte of RAM. It used more than 512 kilobytes of RAM. And given how the Atari ST was designed, more than 512 kilobytes of RAM meant that you need a 1 megabyte machine. The next reason why you may want more RAM is for creation of documents, whether they be word processing documents. You'd be limited to the size of the number of pages that you could actually work with in a word processor by the RAM that you had. If you're writing a term paper, not a big deal. If you're writing a novel, that becomes a bigger deal. If you start looking at desktop publishing, you're limited. The file size is limited to the amount of RAM that you have to work with. More RAM equals larger files. The same thing goes with music software as well. Software such as Cubase, etc. So that was one of the biggest reasons why more RAM would have been added earlier on in the life cycle. And if you work with those today, another reason why you might want more RAM. Now, The last reason kind of is similar to what we may see, why we might want more RAM in our computers today. If you want more Chrome browser tabs, more programs open on your modern computer today, more RAM is helpful. So you're not having to cache between your hard drive. You actually hold those programs, tabs, in the RAM. The same thing applies to the Atari ST when it's running a preemptive multitasking operating system, such as Mint or Geneva. And in those cases, if you are someone who likes to mess around in those kind of operating system desktop environments, Mint or Geneva NeoDesk, that allows for you to work on a document while listening to chiptune software or whatnot. You can run multiple programs at the same time. More RAM means running more software concurrently. So say you want to upgrade your lovely Atari ST and upgrade the RAM, that is, right? You know, before you go down that path, I'd encourage you to just ask yourself the question, what do you want to do with it? And why do you want the RAM? Because to be frank, I mean, if it's an Atari ST, just upgrade it. That's cake. But all the other computers, there's going to be a little more work, cost, etc. involved in making that happen. So first off, if you want to play games from floppy disk or a GoTech, well, in most instances, unless you're playing the more advanced games, the later games, 512 kilobytes of RAM will cover you in most instances, right? If there's specific games that you're interested in, like I was in Civilization or Ultima 6, obviously you'll want to upgrade at least to 1 megabyte of RAM. And 512 kilobytes is probably okay in most instances, but 1 megabyte, you get 1 megabyte, you're golden, you're fine. Say you want to use a hard drive so that you can have an enormous software library at your fingertips. Well, in that case, 512 kilobytes of RAM is probably not enough. You're going to find yourself severely limited. There will be software programs that will run okay, but the majority, you're going to start running into limitations relatively quickly. 1 megabyte, I would say that's a minimum, and it'll probably get you working pretty perfectly across the board. Most software will work just fine. You'll probably be okay. But at the end of the day, anything greater than 1 megabyte would be ideal. If you have 2 megabytes, great. You don't need to max it out at 4 megabytes if you already have 2 megabytes available in your computer. You're fine. Now, if you're one of those folks who wants to get back into creating music the old-fashioned way, using Cubase, or you want to do desktop publishing on an Atari ST for whatever reason, 4 megabytes, maxing out, get the maximum you can in that computer is probably the best way to go. Really, I mean, and I know there are people who really do still use their Atari STs to compose music for XYZ reasons. Awesome, more power to you. 4 megabytes is probably the minimum of what you want. Oh, it's the maximum and the minimum. You probably want to get as much as you possibly can. If you watch my videos, you know that I am a tinkerer, and I just like to max things out. And if you like just maxing things out, well, the only way to go is 4 megabytes. And it's not tremendously difficult. It is something that there is a little risk involved, but in general, it's not a tremendously difficult thing to do. So you've decided that you want to upgrade the RAM in your Atari ST, that there is a use case for you to have it. How do you go about doing that? Well, let's start with the easiest, simplest case. If you have an STE, an Atari 1040, 520 STE, any of the STEs or Mega STE, that's the absolute simplest option. Get 4 1 megabyte 30-pin RAM SIMs. Simple as that. Non-parity is recommended, as parity RAM can cause instability. Carefully remove the existing RAM SIMs from the SIM sockets and then replace with the new ones. If you have that STE, there's no reason why you wouldn't want to max it out, because really it's very simple, and the cost, at least in the United States, it's less than $20 to get 4 megabytes. The next simplest option in my mind is what I call the natural upgrade option. And what do I mean by natural upgrade? Well, you have the 520 STF and then the Mega ST2. Both of those motherboards, the 520 STFs, and there's a lot of different 520 STF motherboards, I understand that. They are the exact same as the 1040 STF motherboards. They simply have half the RAM populated. That's as simple as that. The same thing goes for the Mega ST2 or Mega 2 and the Mega ST4. The Mega ST2 and Mega ST4, exact same motherboard. The 2 megabyte version simply has half the RAM points populated. So to upgrade the RAM is a relatively simple soldering process. You do need to solder. It's not complex though. It's just fairly basic through-hole soldering. Step number 1, clear out the RAM solder points. Number 2, I would recommend soldering in sockets. It's not required to solder in sockets, but I'd recommend get some sockets and solder them in place. 3, add decoupling capacitors. I don't know if it's 0.1 nanofarad or whatever it is. You can look it up. You just have a couple of decoupling capacitors, or not a few decoupling capacitors, one for each RAM chip that you need to add as well. And then in some instances, and step number 4 would be to add 3 resistors. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. But you'd add those three resistors in place as well. And voila, you've doubled your RAM from 512 kilobytes to 1 megabyte, or from 2 megabytes to 4 megabytes. All other upgrades, you can call them hacks because they effectively are hacks in some way, shape, or form. But they've been around since the 80s and 90s. Literally, as soon as the 520 ST was released, within a matter of a couple months, there were upgrades available to upgrade the 512 kilobytes RAM to 1 megabyte of RAM. The piggybacking methodology that was used, piggybacking another set of RAM chips on top of the first set of RAM chips. So this was available. And not only that, there were commercially available, relatively easily installable or not so easily installable versions of different types of upgrades. Now, they enabled configurations to upgrade from half a megabyte to 1 megabyte to 2 megabytes to 2.5 megabytes to 4 megabytes. And I've seen all of those, right? And in my experience, at least 1 in 10, 2 in 10, and 1 in 5 of the STs that I've worked on, somewhere around there, have had some sort of RAM upgrade in them. Whether it's a piggyback model or a commercially available board that was connected and soldered in place with a nest of wires throughout it. Some were very clean, some were a mess, and some were just, I don't know what it's doing, but it's working, right? Nowadays, to upgrade your RAM, there's a few options, few commercially available options that are out there, it's great that we still have those and they're produced on a pretty regular basis. Let's start with the simplest. There's a solderless option that replicates what we call a MARPET upgrade that existed in the heyday of the Atari ST. These solderless versions came with, it's like a little circuit board, an MMU hat, top hat that slots into the MMU with the chip installed to pull signals off and inject signals into the MMU. And then there's also another side of that connector that fits in the shifter chip socket, and the shifter chip fits back into that board there as well. Again, to pull different signals and inject different signals into the Atari ST. Those work like a charm, and they're pretty simple to install without any soldering. So fairly simple for anyone to do. Now, the only downside with the MMU hat solderless upgrade, RAM upgrade, is that it can be, like any chip can kind of work its way out of its socket. Likewise, the hat can work its way out of the socket and lose continuity with the pins it's supposed to connect with. And when that happens, you get RAM errors, all right? And if you're okay with just opening up your computer, reseating everything, and turning it back on, that fixes the problems pretty much every single time. So is it a game changer? No. Is it gonna stop you from doing it and mean that you've broken your computer? Not at all, right? And it's relatively simple to fix up again. Now, in addition to the solderless version of an upgrade, there are soldered adapters of a lot of different types. You have commercial, you have public projects, found on the PCBWay public projects board that are available to use. These soldering upgrades tend to be more stable and reliable than the solderless versions because, well, you have a physical contact versus a soldered contact. As simple as that. But you have to be comfortable with the soldering at this level. Consider it complex through hole with maybe a little bit of surface mount if you have to build the board yourself, the RAM upgrade boards. If you buy the RAM upgrade boards yourself, it's through hole soldering. It's not tremendously complex. But anytime you put heat to your board and remove stuff and solder stuff in, you run a risk of damaging things potentially. The last consideration is that before you buy anything, make sure you research exactly what kind of board you have, because there are some very different configurations in the Atari STFs in particular. The 520 STs are a little more uniform, the short boards, short cases, but the STFs and STFMs, there's a lot more variety in the layouts on the boards. So double, triple check to make sure that what you're getting will work with the board that you have. I hope you found this overview of the Atari ST and RAM helpful, useful, interesting, if nothing else. Put in your comments below if you have some thoughts that you want to share. If you want to watch videos of me actually upgrading RAM, there's a few videos in my catalog of adding RAM boards to 520 STs, I think at least 2, if not 3. So take a look at those. It's not a tremendously difficult upgrade to put in play. As you can kind of see, there's a lot of options available to you and a number of reasons why you may want to do it. But at the same time, if you already have 1 megabyte of RAM, you probably are okay, unless you want to do some more advanced things. All right, thanks for watching and have a fantastic day. Bye.